Ever get sucked into those like social media arguments? You know, the ones where it seems like everybody's got all the answers and nuance just goes out the window?
Totally. It's like that online disengagement is its own beast.
Yeah. And John Inazu, who, by the way, is a law professor, starts his book, NUW Learning to Disagree, with this, like, totally relatable train wreck. Picture this. He's glued to his phone, watching two other law professors going at it online about abortion. And get this, he should be prepping for his own class.
You know, what really struck me about that opening is that Inazu uses this experience that, let's be honest, we've all had scrolling when we should be doing something else to talk about the challenges of empathy in our digital world. It's so easy to forget there's an actual person on the other side of the screen, someone with their own story, their own experiences.
Right, it's like social media turns disagreement into the spectator sport, right? You're just watching the wreckage. But Inazu argues that this kind of empathy, this ability to, like, really try to understand where someone's coming from, even when you disagree, is essential if you want to have productive conversations, especially about the really tough, divisive stuff.
And this is where his background as a law professor really shines through, I think. He's not just talking about Twitter spats here. He's talking about equipping future lawyers,
Yes.
those who are going to be arguing in courtrooms, with the skills to not just argue, but to actually try to understand the other side's perspective.
Okay, so how do we actually do that? How do we get better at this whole empathy thing, especially when we're dealing with people who see the world so differently from us?
Well, Inazu dives into this with a case study that's just, well, it's a wild one. He brings up the story of Dudley and Stevens, and it's a case of cannibalism at sea.
Okay, you've definitely got my attention now.
So picture this. It's 1884. You have 4 English sailors. They're shipwrecked, stuck on a lifeboat, barely any food or water. Weeks go by. These guys are starving, desperate. And the captain, Dudley, he proposes this unthinkable solution. They should kill and eat the weakest one among them, a young cabin boy named Richard Parker.
Wow, wow. I mean, where do you even begin to process something like that?
Right. It's one of those stories that just grabs you, and it's easy to sit back and judge from a distance. Right? But Inazu, he does this really interesting thing. He asks us to consider the context. Like, really consider, what would we do in that kind of situation? Facing death? Starving? Can we really judge these sailors without even trying to grasp the desperation that drove them to that horrific act?
It's kind of like that saying, don't judge a man until you've walked a mile in his shoes.
Exactly. And Inazu isn't saying what they did was right, not at all. But he is forcing us to confront the limits of our own empathy. Like, how much can we really understand what it's like to be in someone else's shoes, especially when those shoes have walked through something we can't even imagine?
So it's a reminder that context matters a lot.
Absolutely. And what's even more interesting is how Inazu takes this extreme example of cannibalism at sea and connects it to those everyday situations where we're so quick to judge without really understanding what's going on. Like that coworker who snaps at you. Maybe they're dealing with a sick family member. Or that friend who makes a totally tone-deaf comment. Maybe their life experiences have shaped their perspective in ways we don't even realize.
It's like trying to understand the why behind people's actions, to look beyond just that surface level and remember that everybody's carrying something.
Yes. And that idea, seeking different perspectives, that's a huge thread that runs through the whole book. And it leads us directly to Inazu's thoughts on, you guessed it, free speech. And let me tell you, his take on this is more relevant than ever.
And he doesn't shy away from controversy either. I mean, he dives headfirst into the gender pronoun debate, which is guaranteed to get people fired up.
Oh yeah. And he recognizes the tension there, for sure.
Yeah.
On one hand, there's this desire to be respectful, to use people's preferred pronouns, to acknowledge their identities. But on the other hand, there are some who feel like they're being forced to speak in a way that goes against their own deeply held beliefs.
So how do you even begin to navigate that minefield?
Well, Inazu suggests finding this kind of middle ground between what he calls civic responsibility and civic grace. Basically, it's about being mindful of your words and how they might land on other people, even when you're trying to express your own views honestly. He even offers this practical tip. Sometimes simply using someone's name instead of pronouns can be a way to kind of sidestep that whole issue while still being respectful.
It's a good reminder that we don't always have to turn every conversation into a battle, right? Sometimes a little bit of common courtesy can go a long way.
Absolutely. And speaking of common ground, or maybe the lack thereof, Inazu tackles another biggie, fairness. And he makes this point that fairness isn't this fixed, objective thing. It's shaped by our own experiences, our values, our backgrounds.
So what seems fair to one person might seem totally unreasonable to someone else.
Exactly. And to illustrate this, he uses this example that I think a lot of people can relate to. Gunners in the classroom. Those students who dominate every discussion.
Oh, yeah. We've all encountered a gunner or two.
Right. So Inazu, he points out that while law school especially is all about individual achievement, acing those exams, getting the best grades, being a good lawyer requires more than just book smarts. It requires collaboration, teamwork, and this sense of fairness in how you interact with others, how you share space.
It's like he's saying that being a good lawyer, and maybe even just a good person, requires thinking beyond just yourself and your own success.
Totally. And to dig deeper into this whole fairness thing, he brings up some fascinating legal cases. Like, he talks about this thing called Russian poker. And, well, it's as crazy as it sounds.
Okay, now I'm intrigued. Russian poker, what is that?
So it's this deadly game of chance where people basically take turns pointing a loaded gun at each other's heads and pulling the trigger.
Wait, people actually play this? That's insane.
I know, right? It's hard to believe, but it's a real thing. And here's the kicker. In some places, if someone dies during this game, the person who pulled the trigger can actually be charged with murder, even if they didn't intend to kill.
Wow. That really throws a wrench into things. So is that fair? I mean, you have the recklessness, the disregard for human life, but you also have the lack of intent to actually kill.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that's exactly what Inazu wants us to grapple with. Where do we draw the line? What makes one act more deserving of punishment than another?
It seems like our sense of fairness is often driven by our emotional response to a situation, right? Like something just feels wrong, even if we can't always articulate why.
You hit the nail on the head. And Inazu really drives this point home by sharing a personal anecdote. He talks about this time he got out of a traffic ticket by simply explaining his situation to the prosecutor. He was upfront, honest. The prosecutor let him off. But then he reflects on that experience and asks, would someone less privileged, someone who maybe doesn't have the same confidence or ability to advocate for themselves, would they have been treated the same way?
It makes you wonder how much privilege plays a role in how we experience and perceive fairness.
It's a huge factor, for sure. And Inazu doesn't shy away from acknowledging his own privilege. In fact, he uses another anecdote, this time from his own faculty meetings, to show how those subtle power dynamics can play out even in the most mundane situations.
Okay, I'm curious, what kind of power dynamics go down in a faculty meeting?
Well, apparently, in Inazu's department, there's this one coveted seat. It's way in the back, perfect for, I don't know, a little bit of distance, maybe some discreet email checking during those long meetings.
Ah, the power seat. Every workplace has one.
Right. And in Inazu, he has this kind of playful rivalry with his colleague, Brenda, over who gets to claim the power seat. It's actually pretty funny. But then things take a turn, and the playful competition over seating arrangements gets overshadowed by this much bigger issue, a debate about the university's free speech policy.
Uh-oh. That sounds a little less lighthearted. What sparked the debate?
So it all started with a student protest on the anniversary of 9/11. The college Republicans had placed American flags all around campus, and this Muslim student who was protesting the war in Iraq, he removed some of the flags.
I can see where this is going. That's going to ruffle some feathers.
Yeah, it totally blew up. The whole thing was caught on video, of course, shared online, and it just escalated from there. There were threats, harassment directed at the student who removed the flags. It became this whole debate about what should happen to the student, about the limits of free speech, especially when it comes to sensitive topics like 9/11.
It's that classic dilemma, right? Trying to balance free expression with creating a safe and inclusive environment. Not easy.
And Inazu uses this case study to really highlight how tricky it can be to navigate these complex conversations. He acknowledges both sides, the right to protest, the right to commemorate, but he also stresses the importance of context. Like, you can't separate this incident from the historical weight of 9/11, from the ongoing debates about the war in Iraq.
So how do you even begin to approach these kinds of sensitive situations? Does he offer any guidance?
He does. He circles back to that idea of civic responsibility and civic grace. Basically, he's saying, be willing to engage in these tough conversations, even when you disagree. But do it with respect, with a genuine desire to understand where the other person is coming from.
It's that balance between staying true to your own beliefs while also being open to dialogue, to understanding a different perspective. Easier said than done, though, right? Especially these days.
It's definitely a challenge, especially in our current climate where everything feels so polarized. But Inazu argues that these difficult conversations are crucial for a healthy society. He stresses the importance of knowing what you believe, what your values are, and being able to articulate them thoughtfully and respectfully.
And it's not just about public debates or campus controversies, right? I mean, these challenges pop up in our personal lives, too.
Absolutely. And one example that really stood out to me was Inazu's experience teaching a unit on sexual assault in his criminal law class.
That's such a sensitive and difficult topic to teach, especially in a law school setting.
Exactly. And Inazu, he's honest about the fact that he's made mistakes, that he's still learning how to navigate these conversations with sensitivity and nuance. He even shares this story about a student who made this incredibly insensitive comment about a victim's clothing, implying that she was somehow responsible for the assault.
Ugh, that's just awful. And it's a reminder that these harmful attitudes, these misconceptions about sexual assault, they're still out there, even in a place like a law school classroom.
It was a real eye-opener for Inazu, for sure. And it really highlighted the importance of creating this classroom environment where students feel safe grappling with these tough issues, where they can ask questions, make mistakes, and learn from each other, all without fear of judgment or ridicule.
But it's a delicate balance, right?
Yeah.
You want to create that safe space, but you also need to have honest dialogue, even when it's uncomfortable.
Exactly. And Inazu, he emphasizes that these challenging moments, as difficult as they are, can actually be opportunities for growth and learning, both for the students and for himself as an educator.
It's like that idea that sometimes the best learning happens when we're a little bit uncomfortable, when we're forced to confront our own biases and assumptions.
Precisely. And speaking of uncomfortable conversations, Inazu shares another anecdote, this time from a Thanksgiving dinner at his church. He overheard this really tense conversation about critical race theory. It's become such a hot-button issue lately.
It feels like everyone's got an opinion on critical race theory these days, but I'm not sure everyone actually understands what it is.
That's exactly what Inazu observed at that Thanksgiving dinner. One person was saying they were really concerned about critical race theory because it was teaching kids to hate America. And it was clear from the conversation that this person didn't really have a firm grasp on what critical race theory actually is or what it aims to do.
It's amazing how quickly these complex ideas can get twisted and distorted, especially in casual conversations.
And what's interesting is that Inazu, even as he's overhearing this conversation, he starts to reflect on his own understanding of critical race theory. He acknowledges its strengths, its weaknesses, but he also cautions against just dismissing or condemning those who have different views.
It's about trying to understand the other side's perspective, even if we don't agree with it, right?
Right. And Inazu even gets personal, sharing his own experiences with race and privilege. He talks about how he grew up attending mostly white churches and how he became increasingly aware of how white culture often sets the unspoken norms, even in spaces that seem welcoming and inclusive.
It's that idea of unconscious bias. Like, even with the best intentions, we can perpetuate inequalities if we're not really paying attention.
And that's why these conversations about race, about privilege, they're so important even when they're uncomfortable.
It's about being willing to have those tough conversations, to be wrong, to learn, and to grow.
Exactly. And Inazu's reflections on critical race theory, they're just one example of how he encourages us to approach all disagreements, whether it's about politics, religion, or even just everyday conflicts, with more nuance and understanding. And that leads us to another area he explores, faith. And it's not always about traditional religion. He argues that, in a way, we all have faith in something.
Interesting. So it's not just about whether you go to church or what religion you practice. It's more about those core beliefs and values that shape how you see the world, right?
Exactly. And to illustrate this, he takes us back to the courtroom with this really unusual case involving, well, a very unconventional church. It's the case of the Neo-American Church.
Neo-American Church. Okay, I've never heard of that one. What's their deal?
Let's just say their services weren't your typical Sunday morning affair.
Okay, now you have to elaborate. What made this church so unique?
Well, their central religious practice, the thing they built their whole belief system around, was using LSD and marijuana as sacraments.
Hold up. LSD is a sacrament. You're kidding.
Nope, totally serious. As you can imagine, this didn't go over too well with the powers that be.
I can only imagine. The court case must have been something else.
It was. The church, they argued that their drug use should be protected under the First Amendment's Freedom of Religion Clause.
Bold move. I bet the court wasn't buying it.
You're right. The court basically said, nice try, and ruled that the government has a valid interest in enforcing drug laws, even if those laws conflict with someone's religious practices.
So freedom of religion has its limits.
It does. But here's where Inazu brings it back around. He uses this case, as out there as it might seem, to make a bigger point about how we approach beliefs that are different from our own. He's saying that just because we might find someone else's beliefs strange, unusual, maybe even absurd, doesn't mean those beliefs aren't deeply meaningful to them.
It's a good reminder to, not be so quick to judge.
Exactly. It's about approaching those different beliefs with a bit of humility, with a willingness to at least try to understand where the other person's coming from.
It's about remembering that we all have our own journeys, our own experiences that shape who we are and what we believe.
And speaking of journeys and experiences, Inazu takes us from LSD sacraments to, well, a topic that's practically a national pastime, patriotism. And he gets really honest about his own complicated relationship with it. He even uses Lee Greenwood's God Bless the USA as an example.
Oh, that's an interesting choice. It's one of those songs that tends to evoke strong emotions, for better or worse.
Exactly. And Inazu talks about how, back when he was in the military, that song used to fill him with this sense of pride and patriotism. But as he's gotten older, he's also become aware of how that kind of patriotism, the kind that's often wrapped up in these very specific symbols and narratives, can sometimes be exclusionary. Not everyone connects with that God Bless the USA message in the same way.
It raises an important question. How do we celebrate national identity in a way that feels inclusive, that respects everyone's beliefs and backgrounds?
That's the challenge, isn't it? And Inazu seems to be suggesting that healthy patriotism should be about more than just blind allegiance or unquestioning devotion. It should be rooted in a clear-eyed understanding of our nation's history, the good and the bad, and a commitment to those ideals of equality, justice, and liberty for all citizens.
It's about recognizing that our country is always a work in progress, and that true patriotism involves holding our leaders accountable and striving to create a more just and equitable society for everyone.
And speaking of shaping young minds and grappling with complicated histories, Inazu delves into the often contentious debate surrounding religious influence in public schools.
Oh, that's a topic that's guaranteed to spark some strong opinions. You've got those who believe religion should be front and center in schools, and you've got those who believe it should be kept completely separate.
It's this constant balancing act, right? Trying to respect the separation of church and state while also acknowledging the role that religion plays in history, culture, and the lives of many individuals.
And it often feels like a tug of war, with each side vying for influence over what gets taught and how it gets taught.
Exactly. And Inazu uses the example of textbook battles, specifically in Texas, which, as you may know, has a huge influence over the textbook market.
Right, what happens in Texas textbooks doesn't stay in Texas textbooks.
Exactly. And he points out that these battles often boil down to this: whose version of history gets told? Whose narrative wins out?
It's a good reminder that education, even something as seemingly straightforward as a history textbook, is never truly neutral. The choices we make about what to include, what to emphasize, what to leave out, they all reflect a certain set of values and beliefs.
It's about recognizing that every story, every historical event can be told from multiple perspectives, and those perspectives shape how we understand the past, the present, and even the future.
It's about encouraging critical thinking, asking those tough questions, and being open to different viewpoints. And that brings us to a question that feels particularly relevant today. Is forgiveness even possible? Especially in our current climate of division and polarization.
It's a question that Inazu grapples with throughout the book, and he explores it through the lens of the COVID-19 pandemic, a time marked by so much uncertainty, fear, and yes, division.
I think we can all relate to that, right? The pandemic really tested our relationships, our patience, our capacity for understanding and empathy.
It really did. And Inazu shares a personal anecdote about writing an op-ed where he advocated for forgiveness and repentance in a post-pandemic world. He suggested that we all take a long, hard look in the mirror, acknowledge our own missteps during that time, and try to extend an olive branch to mend relationships that were fractured by disagreements over pandemic policies.
I'm guessing that didn't go over so well with everyone.
You would be correct. He was bombarded with angry emails and comments from people across the political spectrum. Some were furious at the mere suggestion of forgiving those who opposed mask mandates or vaccines. Others were adamant that those who supported lockdowns or school closures should never be forgiven.
It seems like the pandemic really amplified our capacity for holding grudges. It's like forgiveness became the ultimate casualty.
It's definitely a challenge, especially when we feel deeply wronged, when we believe we're morally right. But Inazu doesn't let us off the hook that easily. He reminds us that forgiveness, true forgiveness, isn't about the other person. It's not about condoning their actions or saying that what they did was okay. It's about us. It's about choosing to let go of the anger, the resentment, that can eat away at us if we hold on to it for too long.
It's about recognizing that holding on to anger hurts us more than it hurts the person we're angry at.
And he illustrates this with a powerful example from his own family's history. His grandparents were interned during World War II at Manzanar, one of those camps where Japanese Americans were unjustly imprisoned.
It's a dark chapter in American history and a stark reminder of what can happen when fear, prejudice, and unchecked power run rampant.
It is. And Inazu talks about the hardships his grandparents endured, the loss of their home, the separation from loved ones, the constant fear and uncertainty. But what's truly remarkable is their capacity for forgiveness.
Forgiveness after everything they went through.
Yes. Years later, when the U.S. government finally issued a formal apology for the internment, Inazu's grandmother, she accepted that apology. She made the conscious decision to forgive.
It's a powerful story. It makes you really think about those moments in your own life when forgiveness felt impossible. But maybe it wasn't,
It's about recognizing that forgiveness isn't a sign of weakness. It's an act of incredible strength and resilience.
And it's not about letting the other person off the hook. It's about freeing yourself from that anger and resentment.
Inazu talks about how forgiveness is often more about the forgiver than the forgiven. It's about choosing to heal, to move forward, rather than remaining trapped in the past.
And he brings this idea down to earth, right? He connects it back to the classroom with the story of Jennifer, that student who really challenged him.
Ah, yes, Jennifer. The one who called him out for potential misogyny in his reading list.
That's the one. I remember thinking, ooh, she went there. But you know what? Now that you mention it, I think I see what Inazu was trying to do. He didn't just shut her down, did he?
Not at all. He actually used that as an opportunity to model the kind of thoughtful disagreement he keeps talking about.
So how did that play out?
Well, he starts by acknowledging that initially, yeah, Jennifer's writing wasn't great. She was relying on these kind of surface-level critiques, not really engaging with the material on a deeper level. And, it would have been easy for him to just dismiss her, to be like, oh, another student who hasn't done the reading.
Especially in law school, right? Where everyone's trying to impress the professor.
Totally. But he didn't. Instead, he kept pushing her. He asked her to back up her claims, to really think critically about the arguments she was making. He challenged her to consider different perspectives, even when she was convinced she was right.
Did she come around?
She did. By the end of the semester, she wasn't just parroting opinions. She was forming her own, backing them up with evidence. And her writing, it reflected that growth. Inazu even said he was impressed with her final paper.
That's amazing. It's a good reminder that sometimes the people we initially clash with, the ones who push our buttons, they can also be our greatest teachers if we're open to it.
It's about recognizing that growth is possible for anyone, even when it comes to deeply held beliefs, as long as we're willing to stay open-minded and engage in those tough conversations.
So it's not about avoiding disagreement altogether, but about finding ways to disagree better.
Exactly. And speaking of finding common ground with those who see the world differently, Inazu shares a story about his unlikely friendship with a conservative acquaintance, a guy named Jack.
Unlikely friendship. Tell me more. How does that dynamic work?
Well, it seems even law professors need a break from the world of academia. Inazu and Jack, they bond over their shared love of golf.
Golf. That's not the first thing that comes to mind when I think of a law professor.
Right. Inazu himself admits that he's not exactly a golf pro, but he enjoys it for what it is. A chance to unwind, to enjoy some friendly competition, and just to connect with another human being, even one who holds different political views.
It reminds me of that point Inazu made about fairness not being this fixed objective thing. It's about finding that balance, right? Between engaging in healthy debate and just appreciating someone for who they are, even when you disagree with them.
It's about recognizing the humanity in everyone, regardless of their political affiliation. And I think that's something we could all use a little more of these days.
Absolutely. And Inazu, he seems to have a knack for finding those moments of connection, even in unexpected places. He talks about being at his law school graduation ceremony, looking out at all the graduating students and feeling this overwhelming sense of pride.
It's like in that moment, he's not seeing them as Democrats or Republicans, liberals or conservatives. He's seeing them as individuals, each with their own unique story, their own journey that led them to that moment.
It's a good reminder that we're all more than just our political beliefs, right? There's so much more to each of us than that.
Exactly. And I think that's what Inazu wants us to remember as we navigate this increasingly complex and divided world. It's about resisting the urge to put people into those neat little boxes,
Huh.
to reduce them to just their political ideologies.
It's about remembering that there's a whole person there, with thoughts, feelings, experiences, and yes, beliefs that might be different from our own, and that's okay.
And ultimately, I think that's where Inazu's message of learning to disagree really resonates. It's about approaching those differences with curiosity rather than judgment, with a willingness to listen and learn, even when it's uncomfortable.
So it's not about erasing those differences or pretending they don't exist. It's about finding ways to bridge those divides, to have those tough conversations with more empathy, more understanding, and a genuine desire to connect with the human being on the other side. It's like he's saying, instead of immediately jumping to those labels, those assumptions about who someone is based on their political beliefs, let's try to see the person behind the label.
It's about recognizing that our shared humanity matters more than our political differences.
So much more. But, okay, that's all well and good in theory, right? But how do we actually do that? How do we put this into practice, especially in the heat of the moment when those disagreements get heated?
Well, one of the things that Inazu emphasizes is that we don't have to engage in every single battle. He uses this great analogy of a boxer in the ring. You know, a good boxer, they don't just throw punches randomly. They're strategic. They choose their battles.
So it's about being more discerning with our energy. Like, not every hill is worth dying on, right?
Exactly. And I think that's especially important these days when it feels like we're constantly bombarded with opportunities for outrage.
Yeah.
You know. So before you jump into that comment section, before you fire off that angry tweet, ask yourself, is this really worth my time and energy? Is this a battle I actually care about fighting?
It's about being more intentional with our disagreements. And when we do choose to engage, he says it's crucial to stay grounded in our values.
Right? Like, what are you hoping to achieve by engaging in this conversation? Are you just trying to score points, prove you're right? Or are you actually trying to have a meaningful dialogue, to understand and be understood?
It's about approaching those conversations with the right intentions. Which, let's be honest, isn't always easy, especially when we're feeling triggered, when our emotions are running high.
Absolutely. And that's where empathy comes in. Inazu keeps coming back to this idea that if we can really try to understand where the other person is coming from, even if we don't agree with them, it can completely change the tone of the conversation.
It's about remembering that there's usually a story behind those beliefs, right? Like, what are the experiences that have shaped how this person sees the world?
Exactly. And even if we don't agree with their conclusions, we can at least try to understand how they got there. And sometimes that's all it takes to de-escalate a situation, to find a little bit of common ground.
It's about approaching those conversations with curiosity rather than judgment. But what about those situations where, despite our best efforts, it feels like common ground is just impossible to find? Those conversations where you're just talking past each other.
Well, in those cases, Inazu suggests that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply listen. Really listen, not just to formulate our next argument, but to truly understand the other person's perspective.
It's about recognizing that sometimes the most important conversations aren't about winning or losing, but about simply hearing each other.
Exactly. And that requires a certain level of, well, humility, I think. A willingness to admit that maybe we don't have all the answers, that maybe there's something to learn from someone who sees the world differently than we do.
It's about being open to having our minds changed. And that requires a certain level of self-awareness too, doesn't it? Like being aware of our own biases, our own triggers, and how those might be influencing how we approach disagreements.
Absolutely. Inazu talks about how self-reflection is crucial for becoming better at disagreeing. Like, he encourages us to ask ourselves, how do I typically react in disagreements? Do I shut down, get defensive, resort to personal attacks? Once we start to recognize those patterns, we can start to change them.
It's about taking responsibility for our role in those interactions, recognizing that we're not always the perfectly rational beings we'd like to think we are.
We're all a work in progress, right? And learning to disagree well, it's a journey, not a destination. There are going to be times when we mess up, when we say the wrong thing, when we let our emotions get the best of us.
The key is to keep trying, keep learning, keep extending ourselves and others a little bit of grace.
And to remember that it's okay to disagree. In fact, disagreement can be a good thing. It's how we learn and grow and make progress. But we have to learn to do it better, with more empathy, more respect, and a genuine desire to understand those different perspectives.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive into learning to disagree, I think the biggest takeaway here is that it is possible to disagree better. It's not about pretending we all agree or silencing those who hold different views. It's about finding ways to engage with those differences constructively, to have those tough conversations with more grace, more empathy, and a genuine desire to understand those different perspectives.
It's about recognizing our shared humanity and remembering that even in the midst of disagreement, we can still find ways to connect, to learn, and to grow together.
And if you're looking for practical strategies to do just that, I highly recommend checking out John Inazu's book, Learning to Disagree. It's a powerful read, and I think it has the potential to change not just how we disagree, but how we see the world.